When the bombs dropped on October 23, 2077, 122 vaults sealed their doors across America, and inside them sat thousands of ordinary people who believed they'd been saved. Some of those doors would open onto working towns and quiet farms. Others would open onto empty rooms, or nothing at all. For every vault that raised children and rebuilt a life above ground, there's another where the last resident died at a desk, or a control panel, or the bottom of a stairwell, never knowing why. A handful became strongholds. A few became legends. Most of them just became silent. Here's the part that unsettles me. Vault-Tec kept records, detailed ones. Population counts, experiment parameters, observer notes, and a lot of that data survived the war intact, waiting in terminals for anyone patient enough to read it. So we can actually trace what became of nearly every group that walked through those enormous steel doors. But before we can understand where they ended up, we need to know what Vault-Tec actually built, and why none of it was meant to save anyone. The advertisements promised safety, clean water, hydroponic gardens, room for 1,000 people, and a door thick enough to shrug off a direct hit. Buy your spot, bring your family, and wait out the end of the world in comfort. That was the pitch, and millions of dollars in government contracts made it look official. The reality sat one layer beneath that. Vault-Tec answered to the Enclave, and the Enclave didn't want shelters. They wanted data. Only a small number of vaults were ever meant to function normally. The rest were laboratories, each one built to stress a captive population in a specific way and record how they broke. The residents were screening subjects, sorted by whatever trait an experiment needed. Some vaults tested isolation, some tested crowding, some tested how long a democracy lasts under pressure. The people signing up thought they'd earned a future off a dying planet. They'd actually earned a spot in a controlled trial nobody told them about. And the first vaults to open their doors proved the experiments were already running before the war even started. Vault 8 was one of the honest ones, more or less. It was a control vault, built to work exactly as advertised. 1,000 residents, a functioning GECK terraforming kit, and instructions to stay sealed for 10 years and then open up and rebuild the surrounding land. And it actually did. When the door rolled back around 2091, the residents emerged and founded Vault City on the ruins near Old Nevada. Clean streets, advanced medicine, working infrastructure. By Wasteland standards, it was paradise. The kind of place raiders talked about like a rumor. The experiment here was simple. See what people do when the system doesn't betray them. What they did was build a rigid caste ladder and look down on everyone outside the walls. Citizens on top, servants below, outsiders barely people at all. They called Wastelanders savages and rationed their miracle technology like it was a birthright. A perfect society, if you were born inside. But not every vault was designed to succeed. Some were built to fail in very specific ways. Vault 12 in Bakersfield was handed a death sentence before the first resident ever walked inside. The vault door was engineered to malfunction, to never fully seal, so that a controlled dose of radiation would seep in over the years. Vault-Tec wanted to study long-term exposure on a captive population. By 2083, the survivors had become ghouls. Their skin had turned leathery and gray, their bodies twisted by radiation, but they were alive and they were thinking. They called their settlement Necropolis, and for a time, it was the only ghoul city in the wasteland. A ghoul named Set took control, ruling from the old Vault 12 entrance. The community scraped by on a watershed they'd managed to keep running, trading water for supplies with the few caravans brave enough to deal with ghouls. When the Master's super mutants arrived in 2162, Necropolis held, barely. The Vault Dweller found them there, a civilization born from an experiment in slow death. And while ghouls learned to endure, another vault's residents were learning they'd been locked in with something far worse than radiation. Vault 15 was a social pressure cooker. Vault-Tec deliberately filled it with people from radically different backgrounds, clashing ideologies, conflicting cultures. The experiment was to see how long it would take before the community tore itself apart. It took 52 years. By 2097, the vault's systems were failing and the population had fractured into 4 hostile factions. When they finally evacuated into the Mojave, they didn't stay together, they scattered, each group claiming a piece of the desert. 3 became raider tribes: the Khans, the Vipers, and the Jackals. They terrorized the wastes for generations, built reputations on brutality and chem-fueled violence. The 4th group wanted something different. They headed north, found a settlement site near an old weather station, and named it Shady Sands. One vault, one failed experiment, and from that failure, both the raider clans that would plague California and the seed of what would become the new California Republic. But Shady Sands' success story almost didn't happen because their founders walked into a wasteland that had already been claimed. The Khans were the strongest of Vault 15's raider children. They claimed the territory around Shady Sands, ran protection rackets, took what they wanted. For decades, they were the nightmare caravan drivers whispered about, the gang that owned the roads. Then, in 2161, a vault dweller in a blue jumpsuit walked into their camp at Bitter Springs and killed their leader. The original Khans collapsed, but a survivor named Darion rebuilt them as the new Khans, meaner and more organized. When the Chosen One destroyed them in 2241, the pattern repeated. The great Khans rose in the Mojave, tougher still, their identity forged through 3 generations of destruction and resurrection. By 2281, they were cooking chems for the Legion, caught between 2 empires at Hoover Dam. Some versions of the Mojave saw them ride north to Wyoming to start over one more time with the followers' help. Others saw them die for Caesar. Either way, the Khans traced their line back to a single vault that was designed to fail, and they spent 184 years proving that failure could be a legacy all its own. While raiders built empires on violence, another vault's survivors were building something stranger, a religion. Vault 29 opened in 2090 with 53 children and 0 adults. The experiment was simple. Stock the vault with nobody over age 15, let Harold the robotic overseer raise them, and watch what happens when a generation grows up with no parents, no elders, no one to teach them how the old world worked. Harold did its best. It fed them, taught them to read from pre-war textbooks, kept the lights on. But machines can't teach you how to grieve, or what it means to protect someone weaker than yourself. The kids grew up functional but hollow, their social structures built on guesswork and half-remembered fragments of what a family was supposed to be. When they emerged, they scattered. Some tried to settle near what would become New Canaan, carrying Harold's lessons about community and cooperation. Others wandered east into the canyons of Zion, where isolation and trauma reshaped them into the Sorrows tribe. Both groups shared the same flaw. They trusted too easily, fought too reluctantly, forgave too quickly. And that vulnerability made them perfect targets for a vault whose survivors had been taught that conquest was survival. Vault 34 was designed to fail through abundance. Vault-Tec crammed in double the recommended population, then stocked the armory with enough weapons to fight a small war. The overseer had limited access to the gun locker. The residents did not. For 43 years it worked. Barely. Then in 2054 the reactor started leaking, and the overseer refused to unlock the armory so people could fight their way to the exit. A man named Horowitz led 50 residents in a raid on the weapon stores, shot their way out, and marched through the Mojave until they found Nellis Air Force Base. They sealed themselves inside, surrounded by unexploded ordnance and artillery shells, and called it paradise. The ones who stayed behind got the reactor under control, but the radiation had already done its work. By 2097, the remaining vault dwellers were feral ghouls, shambling through flooded corridors, guarding the armory they'd once fought over. The boomers got their weapons and their fortress. The others got 200 years of forgetting they'd ever been human. But the boomers' artillery paradise was tame compared to what happened when a vault decided to sacrifice some residents for the others. Vault 11's experiment was elegant. Every year, the residents had to sacrifice one person to the mainframe, or everyone dies. The computer told them this on day one. They believed it for 68 years. At first, they voted, trying to be fair. Then the voting blocks formed: justice, power, and later the missionaries. Families traded favors for votes. The justice bloc started threatening opponents' children. When Catherine Stone's husband was nominated, she slept with every bloc leader she could to build a coalition, got him elected overseer, then watched the vault sacrifice him anyway. She formed the missionaries in revenge, and the bodies piled faster. By 2077, 68 overseers had been executed, and the vault had torn itself apart in riots and assassinations. 5 people were left. They stood in front of the sacrifice chamber and refused. The computer congratulated them for valuing human life over fear, opened the vault door, and told them they were free to go. 4 of them walked out. 1 stayed behind and put a bullet in his head, surrounded by terminals that explained the sacrifice was never necessary. And when those 4 survivors walked out, they carried a truth about Vault-Tec that most vaults would never learn. Vault 21 sat beneath the Vegas Strip, sealed for 150 years, while the world above turned to ash. Inside, every decision was made by games of chance. Disputes, elections, resource allocation, all of it settled at card tables and roulette wheels. It worked, for a time, a genuine society where nobody could claim they'd been cheated because the house always had the same odds. Then Robert House woke up in 2274 and started reclaiming Vegas, and the vault's own rules became its undoing. He challenged them to a game for ownership of the entire vault. They accepted, because that's what their culture demanded. House won, and whether the game was fair doesn't really matter anymore. He filled most of the vault with concrete, turned the top level into a hotel, and the residents scattered into the Mojave with nowhere else to go. Sarah Weintraub stayed behind to run the gift shop, watching tourists walk through what used to be her bedroom. The rest joined the ranks of every other vault that opened too late and had nowhere to belong. But while House was sealing vaults, the Mojave's most important vault dwellers were just beginning their transformation. Vault 13 in Southern California was supposed to stay sealed for 200 years, a control group to measure long-term isolation. It almost made it. 97 years in, a water chip failed, and the overseer sent 1 dweller to the surface with 150 days to find a replacement. That dweller found the chip, killed the master, destroyed the Unity's entire super mutant army, and saved what was left of California. The overseer exiled them anyway. Too much exposure to the outside, too much change. The isolation experiment had to continue, and heroes don't fit back into closed systems. Vault 13 sealed its door again and went back to waiting. In 2242, the Enclave finally opened it by force, kidnapped everyone inside, and used them for FEV testing on the oil rig. The longest-running vault experiment in the West ended in a lab, and most of the residents didn't survive to see the chosen one blow the rig into the Pacific. And that exile's journey would ripple across the entire West Coast in ways Vault-Tec never predicted. The Vault Dweller walked north after the exile and founded a village in Oregon called Arroyo. No vault, no experiments, just tribal survival, and a shrine to the vault suit they'd left behind. 2 generations passed. The village grew, then started dying when the droughts came and the land turned toxic. The elder, the vault dweller's daughter, remembered stories about a GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit that could terraform the wasteland. Vault-Tec had promised one to every vault. She didn't know if it was real or a myth her parent had half remembered, but Arroyo was out of options. So in 2241, she sent her own child, the chosen one, to find Vault 13 and bring back salvation. That quest led to the Enclave, to an oil rig full of the old government, planning to purge the wasteland, to a war that ended with the rig sinking and the Enclave scattered. Arroyo got its GECK and survived. The chosen one came home. But the chosen one's grandmother had walked out of a vault that wasn't done with its experiment, because Vault-Tec had sent replacements. After the original dwellers left to found their own settlements, Vault-Tec's plan for Vault 13 kept running without them. The vault was repopulated, but not with people. It became home to a colony of deathclaws, and these weren't the mindless predators the wasteland knew. A Florida research team had made them intelligent. They could speak, reason, and raise their young with something close to tenderness. For a while, it worked. Gruthar, the Alpha, led a peaceful matriarchal community inside those steel walls, and a handful of returning original inhabitants lived alongside them without much trouble. Two very different groups sharing one home, both descended from the same experiment. It's about as close to a happy ending as this place ever gets. Then the Enclave found them. To the Enclave, intelligent deathclaws were a mistake to be corrected, and the humans were just witnesses. They swept through the vault and killed everything inside, the talking deathclaws and the people alike. A sapient species that had existed for barely a generation was erased in an afternoon, and Vault 13 finally went quiet for good. And while Vault 13's story ended in blood, another California Vault survivors were rewriting the entire political map. Back when Vault 15 first opened, its people didn't all become raiders. A group of them wandered north and stopped at a patch of ground with clean water and workable soil. They called it Shady Sands, and a man named Aradesh took charge, less like a warlord and more like a careful farmer worried about the frost. They tamed Brahmin, planted crops, and fought off the raiders and rad scorpions that came sniffing around. Aradesh's daughter Tandy grew up in that town and never really left its cause. When her turn came to lead, she didn't just hold Shady Sands together, she turned it into the new California Republic, a real government with a constitution, a senate, and elections. Tandy served as president for 52 years, long enough that most citizens couldn't remember anyone else in the chair. Under her, the NCR spread across California and into Nevada, stitching together farming towns, trade routes, and old-world ruins into something the wasteland hadn't seen in 2 centuries. It had taxes, courts, a standing army, and enough paperwork to bury a mole rat. Messy and bureaucratic, sure, but it was the first true nation-state to rise from the ashes. But the NCR's expansion brought them into contact with vaults whose survivors had never stopped fighting the Great War. Far to the east, Vault 101 was running one of the simplest experiments on the list, and one of the cruelest. It was never meant to reopen. The assignment was indefinite isolation, a sealed world ruled by a single overseer who told each generation the same thing: the door stays shut forever, and the outside is death. For 200 years it held. People were born, married, and buried without ever seeing the sky, and the overseer's word was the only law they knew. Then a doctor named James did the unthinkable and slipped out through the vault door, and the whole fragile order cracked. The overseer's men started rounding up anyone who might follow, and the vault that had never known violence suddenly had blood in the corridors. His child, the lone wanderer, went after him, and eventually had to make a decision the vault was designed to prevent. Open the door and let 101 join the wasteland, or seal it and preserve the experiment in silence. Whichever way that choice fell, it split the survivors into factions who would carry the fallout for years. And that choice mattered because the Capital Wasteland had become a war zone between two factions that both traced their roots to vaults. The Brotherhood of Steel didn't come from a vault. They came from the people who knew what the vaults really were. Captain Roger Maxson and his men were stationed at Mariposa Military Base in October 2077, guarding the forced evolutionary virus research, when they discovered the human experiments happening in the labs below. 5 days before the bombs fell, Maxson declared desertion from the U.S. Army. The bunker at Lost Hills became their monastery. Vault-Tec's experiments had shown Maxson what pre-war technology could do in the wrong hands, so the Brotherhood made it their mission to keep it out of everyone's hands. By 2161, they were a knightly order in power armor, hoarding energy weapons and circuit boards like scripture. By 2277, Elder Lions had split the Brotherhood into East and West Coast chapters, fighting over whether to help Wastelanders or just collect their tech. They went to war with the Enclave over that technology, over fusion cores and plasma rifles and vault databases. 200 years after the bombs, they were still fighting over the machinery that had ended the world. But the Brotherhood's obsession with technology was nothing compared to the Enclave's obsession with genetic purity and the vault dwellers they considered pure. The Enclave commissioned the vaults, not Vault-Tec's board, not some rogue division. The shadow government that had planned for nuclear war, that had built the oil rig off the California coast and Raven Rock beneath the Virginia mountains. They funded Vault-Tec's sociological experiments because they wanted data on how to rebuild Americans with the right kind of Americans. When the bombs fell, the Enclave survived in their bunkers while 122 vaults played out their scripts. President Richardson on the oil rig, President Eden in Raven Rock's ZAX supercomputer. They watched vault populations through POSE-net terminals, collecting genetic samples, monitoring mutations. In 2242, they released the FEV Curling-13 toxin, designed to kill every mutated organism on the surface. That included nearly everyone who'd survived outside the vaults, and most of the people inside them. Colonel Autumn argued for annexation instead of extermination, but he lost. The Enclave considered Wastelanders contaminated, vault dwellers suspect, anyone exposed to 200 years of radiation fundamentally impure. Only their own lineage, sealed away since 2077, counted as human, and their definition of pure humanity led them to one vault in particular, one that had never been meant to open. Vault 87 wasn't a vault, it was a lab. The Evolutionary Experimentation Program converted it into an FEV research center 11 days after the bombs fell, dipping subjects in modified forced evolutionary virus and documenting the transformations. The scientists didn't evacuate when the mutations started. They kept working. By 2078, they were dipping each other. And by 2078, the facility was producing the super mutants that would terrorize the Capital Wasteland for the next 199 years. The mutations didn't stop. Vault 87's super mutants abducted Wastelanders and dragged them back to the FEV vats, building their numbers through forced conversion instead of reproduction. Thousands of people vanished into that vault over 2 centuries. Most came out as mutants. Fawkes came out immune, his genetic structure somehow rejecting the virus's rewrite. He remembered being human. Most didn't. The Enclave found Vault 87 in Tutos 77 and tried to secure it, not because of the super mutants, but because of the FEV data. 200 years of mutation research, logged and stored. But super mutants weren't the only engineered horrors that emerged from a vault, because one experiment deliberately released its subjects. Vault 22 was supposed to solve food scarcity. Vault-Tec packed it with botanical researchers and agricultural equipment, then sent them into the Zion Canyon area with one mission: develop sustainable crop solutions for a post-nuclear world. For 5 years it worked. They grew food in controlled biomes, experimented with pest-resistant strains, and kept detailed logs of every breakthrough. Then in 2096, they introduced Bovern, a fungal pest control agent harvested from the Zion caves. Within 3 months, 130 staff were infected. The spores didn't just kill, they transformed hosts into ambulatory carriers, shambling through the vault, spreading more spores with every breath. The survivors sealed the infected in the lower levels and fled into the Mojave in 2097, carrying contamination with them. By 2281, Vault 22 sat empty, except for the spore carriers still wandering its flooded depths. But the escapees had already seeded the fungus across the wasteland. Vault 19's red sector found infected pods growing in their ventilation. The NCR's Camp Guardian was overrun by spore carriers that drifted in from the mountains. And while Vault 22's spores spread silently, another Vault's survivors were spreading across the Mojave much more deliberately. Vault 3 was one of the few that worked exactly as advertised. No experiments, no hidden agendas, just a control vault designed to stay sealed for 20 years while surface radiation decayed. The 124 residents waited, raised families, and in 2181, their overseer checked the sensors and opened the door. They'd survived. The all-clear was real. They walked out into sunlight and were slaughtered within 6 hours. The Fiends, a chem-addled raider gang led by Motor Runner, were camped 400 meters from the vault door. They saw easy prey, vault dwellers with no weapons training, no wasteland experience, clutching supply crates and blinking in the light. The massacre was over before noon. Motor Runner moved his entire operation into Vault 3 that same week. He set up his throne in the overseer's office, turned the living quarters into a chem den, and filled the halls with strung-out raiders high on jet and psycho. By 2281, Vault 3 was the Fiend's fortress, its walls still decorated with the original residents' belongings. 20 years of survival, erased in one morning. But not every vault that opened early met raiders. Some met something that looked like salvation. Vault 19 was built in a sulfur quarry 50 miles southwest of Goodsprings, and its experiment was elegantly simple. Divide the residents into red and blue sectors, then feed each side conflicting information about the other. Red sector received reports that blue was hoarding supplies. Blue sector was told red was planning a coup. Neither report was true, but the overseer's terminal logged every escalation. It took 4 years for the paranoia to become unbearable. In 2084, Red Sector discovered the sulfur mining tunnels beneath the vault and used them to escape, convinced Blue Sector was about to attack. Blue Sector fled 3 days later through the same route. Certain Red had abandoned them to die. Both groups scattered into the Mojave, never learning they'd been manipulated. The vault sat empty for 197 years, until the Powder Gangers, escaped convicts from the NCR Correctional Facility, moved in and turned it into a hideout. They found the red and blue jumpsuits still hanging in lockers, the color-coded signs still directing residents to separate sectors. The NCR sent patrols to clear it in 2281, but the gangers held the tunnels. And that manufactured paranoia was gentle compared to what happened when a vault was designed to turn residents against each other for real. Vault 11 ran a different kind of lottery. Every year, the computer demanded the residents sacrifice one person, and every year they elected an overseer, knowing that person would die. The voting blocks formed fast: Justice Block, Power Block, the Vault 11 Residents' Council, each trading favors and threats to control who went to the chamber next. It devolved exactly how you'd expect. Kate Stone's husband was elected, so she slept with every block leader she could to rig the vote against them. The violence escalated until open civil war tore through the atrium in 2282. Only 5 residents survived the fighting, and they made a choice. They refused to sacrifice anyone. The computer congratulated them. Turns out the vault could have stopped the executions anytime the residents simply said no. But Vault-Tec wanted to see how long fear and conformity would keep the cycle running. 205 years, 205 overseers. 4 of those final survivors walked into the Mojave and put bullets in their own heads within a year. And when those 4 survivors walked out, they carried a truth about Vault-Tec that most vaults would never learn. Vault 106 sealed on October 23, 2077, with 107 residents and a full life support system. On November 2nd, 10 days later, psychoactive compounds began venting through the air filtration network. The overseer's logs stop on day 12. Security footage shows residents clawing at walls that weren't there, attacking family members they no longer recognized. By 2277, when the lone wanderer breached the entrance, the vault had been running on emergency power for 80 years. Insane survivors still wandered the halls, their minds so fractured they attacked anything that moved. The drug was still in the air. Vault-Tec's notes in the mainframe called it a study in prolonged hallucinogenic exposure, tracking cognitive decay across generations. There were children's drawings on the walls near the living quarters, dated 2279, which means some of the attacking residents were born after the bombs, raised in a vault where reality itself was poison. The experiment had no end date, no control group, no plan for reversal, but chemical madness was reversible compared to vaults where the isolation itself was the weapon. Vault 108 was designed without an overseer and stocked with a functional cloning lab in the lower levels. The reactor was built to fail after 20 years. When the system started dying in 2097, someone activated the cloning bay and used the only viable template they had, a resident named Gary. The first few clones were stable, helpful even. Then they started copying each other. Each generation degraded faster. Gary 23 could still operate doors. Gary 54 could only repeat his own name. By the time the lone wanderer found the vault in 2277, hundreds of Gary clones filled the corridors, shambling through the dark saying, "Gary," in every inflection, confusion, rage, and something close to grief. They'd killed the original population decades ago, but the cloning bay kept printing more. The terminal logs stop in 2108, which means 170 years of Garys copying Garys in a vault, with no leadership and failing life support. Some of the clones had built barricades, little territories in the residential wings, crude paintings of the name Gary on the walls, like a cargo cult worshipping its own existence. And while Gary clones devolved into violence, another vault's clones were built to replace their originals entirely. Vault 112 sat beneath the ruins of Smith Casey's garage in the Capital Wasteland, and inside, Stanislaus Braun had built his own private eternity. The overseer was a genius, the lead designer of Vault-Tec's RoboBrain technology, and he'd used that expertise to do something no other vault dweller managed. He made himself functionally immortal by uploading his consciousness into a virtual reality simulation. The vault held around 85 residents in suspended animation pods, their minds jacked into a program called Tranquility Lane, a perfect 1950s suburb where Braun played God. For 200 years, those residents lived inside the simulation with no memory of their real lives, aging and dying, and being reset by Braun over and over again. He forced them through scripted tragedies, made them torture each other for his amusement, wiped their memories when they broke. The terminal entries in the vault's mainframe show Braun describing his experiments in clinical language, testing emotional thresholds, observing psychological collapse. One woman, Betty, was actually Braun's avatar, a little girl he used to walk among his victims. The pods kept their bodies alive, IV drips and monitoring systems running on the Vault's fusion reactor. But their minds were trapped in a loop with a sadist who'd had 2 centuries to perfect his cruelty. When the lone wanderer entered Vault 1112 in 2277, most of the original residents were still alive in their pods, still suffering in the simulation. Braun himself remained in Tranquility Lane, even after being given the option to leave, choosing his digital playground over freedom. But Braun's digital torture chamber was at least contained, unlike the Vault whose experiments spilled into the Commonwealth for decades. Vault 75 was built beneath Malden Middle School, and its experiment was called Youth Enhancement. On October 23, 2077, families arrived for what they believed was safety. The Vault staff separated children from their parents at the intake door, then executed every adult within hours. The children were told their parents had been sent to a different section. They were 12 years old, maybe younger. Vault-Tec's goal was genetic perfection through combat trials and selective breeding. The kids were raised in training rooms, pitted against each other in increasingly lethal tests, their progress tracked on terminals in the observation wing. At 18, the best performers were taken to the sublevels and executed, their genetic material harvested and stored. The failures were incinerated. The Overseer's logs describe this as optimizing the Vault's gene pool, removing weak specimens, advancing human evolution. The staff's descendants continued the program for generations, which means for over 150 years, Vault 75 ran a cycle of child soldiers growing up, killing each other, being murdered at adulthood, and replaced by the next batch. Sometime in the early 2200s, one generation of subjects learned the truth. They found the execution chambers, the tissue storage, the records. They killed every staff member in the Vault, then walked out into the Commonwealth and vanished. The terminal logs stop abruptly in 2237, mid-sentence, and that rebellion's timing mattered because the Commonwealth's most important vault had just begun its own escape. Vault 111 opened for occupancy on October 23, 2077, the same day the bombs fell. The marketing called it a suspended animation vault, life support hibernation, while the surface decontaminated. That was the lie. The experiment was long-term cryogenic suspension, freezing residents in individual pods to study the effects of indefinite cryosleep on human physiology. The vault sealed with 54 residents, families from Sanctuary Hills, all of them frozen within minutes. In 2180, 103 years into the experiment, the vault's life support failed. A malfunction in the cryogenic array killed every resident except 4 pods on an independent power circuit. One of those pods held Sean, infant son of Nate and Nora, the couple from Sanctuary. In 2227, a mercenary named Conrad Kellogg entered Vault 111 with scientists from the Institute. They opened Nora's pod, shot her when she wouldn't release the child, took Sean, and refroze Nate as a backup specimen. Nate, later called the sole survivor, woke in 2287 when the Vault's systems finally failed completely. He climbed out of his pod into a tomb, walked past his wife's body still frozen in her chamber, and emerged into the Commonwealth 210 years after the bombs fell with one mission. The Vault's logs showed 50 dead residents, their pods malfunctioning decades earlier, their bodies preserved in the freezing air. But the sole survivor's crisis wasn't just about finding their son. It was about discovering what their son had become. The Institute wasn't a vault at all, but it survived the same way one did. When the bombs fell, the scientists and staff of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology retreated beneath the ruins of their campus, sealed themselves off, and kept working. Over 2 centuries, they burrowed deeper, built clean white laboratories, and turned themselves into the most advanced power the region had ever seen, feared by everyone above ground who only ever saw their handiwork. That handiwork was the synths, artificial humans so lifelike the surface population couldn't tell them from neighbors, and every disappearance and every replaced settler fed the paranoia. The Institute needed clean genetic material to perfect them, and they found it in a child pulled from a cryopod in Vault 111. They took Sean, raised him, and eventually he rose to run the whole operation as its director. So when a parent thawed out 60 years too late, the son they were searching for was already an old man commanding the thing the wasteland dreaded most. And the Institute synths were hunting across the Commonwealth for residents of a vault whose experiment had just reached its conclusion. Vault 81 was sold to its residents as a normal shelter, but the real assignment came in a sealed directive. The medical staff were told to release an experimental pathogen into the general population, then study the outcomes and test their cures on live subjects. Instead, the doctors read the order, refused it outright, and did something almost no other Vault staff ever managed. They took their research, their equipment, and their samples into a hidden secret wing, then sealed the door behind them and let the rest of the Vault believe the whole place was ordinary. Generations of families were born, raised and buried up top, trading, farming mushrooms, running a little economy, never knowing that mole rats and disease cures sat behind the wall beside them. The result was one of the only vaults in the entire program that functioned as a genuine community, a self-sustaining society that greeted the Commonwealth 200 years later, still intact and still trusting. But Vault 81's success was an anomaly, because most vaults weren't designed to have staff who could rebel. Vault 95 was pitched to its residents as a fresh start. Everyone selected had struggled with chem addiction, and the vault came stocked with a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center. For the first 5 years, it actually worked. The residents detoxed, supported each other, and built clean lives underground, exactly the kind of recovery they'd been promised. What they didn't know was that the 5-year mark was the trigger. On schedule, a hidden stash of chems unlocked deep inside the vault, and the experiment measured what happens when a whole community of recovering addicts stumbles onto a fresh supply after years of sobriety. The relapse spread fast, and the withdrawal, the desperation, and the violence tore the population apart, just as the designers expected. By the time the killing stopped, Vault 95 was a corpse-filled ruin, and years later, the mercenary gunners simply moved into the massacre site and used it as a base. And that planned collapse was gentle compared to vaults where the violence was baked into the social structure itself. Vault 114 was supposed to test what happened when wealthy elites were forced to live under the rule of a working-class overseer, a man deliberately chosen for his lack of education and leadership experience. The idea was simple: take the most entitled people in pre-war Boston, strip away their power, and watch the social collapse. But Vault-Tec never got to run that experiment because construction was abandoned before the bombs fell, leaving behind an incomplete shell beneath Park Street Station, with exposed concrete, missing walls, and a half-finished entrance. The vault sat empty for 210 years until a gangster named Skinny Malone moved in with his crew of triggermen, turning the unfinished social experiment into a literal criminal hideout. The irony is almost perfect. Vault-Tec wanted to humiliate Boston's elite by putting them under an unqualified boss, and instead, the vault became home to actual mobsters led by a paranoid thug who got himself killed during a confrontation with a detective. The experiment never ran, but the vault still ended up as a monument to failed authority and petty power. But while Vault 114 never ran its experiment, the West Coast had a vault whose class experiment succeeded and then collapsed anyway. Vault 8 was one of the 17 control vaults, equipped with a functioning Garden of Eden creation kit and designed to open on schedule. In 2091, Exactly 10 years after the war, the door opened and the residents deployed the GECK, transforming the barren Nevada wasteland into the most technologically advanced settlement in the post-war world, Vault City. They had working power, clean water, advanced medical facilities, and a strict social hierarchy that made pre-war Boston look egalitarian. Citizens enjoyed every privilege while servants did the labor, and outsiders were barred entirely unless they could prove their usefulness or buy their way in with years of servitude. The city's leaders were so proud of their vault heritage that they treated wastelanders as genetic inferiors, convinced that their pre-war screening and vault isolation had kept them pure. For decades, Vault City stood as proof that vault culture could thrive in the wasteland, a gleaming technocracy that looked down on everyone else. Then the NCR expanded north, and by 2241, Vault City found itself surrounded by a nation that didn't care about their purity or their protests. And that integration was inevitable, because the NCR had absorbed so many vault populations that vault culture was becoming mainstream, but not every vault wanted to be absorbed. Vault 70's experiment was designed to create a social crisis out of nothing. Every jumpsuit extruder would break down after 6 months, and Vault-Tec expected the clothing shortage to spiral into conflict and collapse. The plan assumed that vault dwellers, stripped of their uniforms and unable to manufacture new ones, would fracture along lines of class and desperation. But the residents of Vault 70 just repaired the machines, then started modifying their jumpsuits when repairs weren't enough, and eventually developed their own textile production using salvaged materials. The crisis never materialized. People adapted, shared resources, and solved the problem like functional adults, which apparently wasn't part of Vault-Tec's calculations. By the time the vault opened, they'd built a successful community whose main distinction was embarrassing the entire premise of the experiment. Vault 70 became another thriving settlement, proof that sometimes the simplest variable, human cooperation, was the one Vault-Tec kept underestimating. But trivial experiments, like clothing crises, were cover for the vaults where Vault-Tec was testing something far darker. Vault 43 was populated with 20 men, 10 women, and 1 panther. Not a mascot, not a holotape simulation. An actual living panther, sealed inside with 30 people who had no idea it was part of the experiment. The genetic bottleneck alone would have doomed them. 10 women and 20 men meant inevitable inbreeding within 2 generations, and Vault-Tec knew it. But the panther accelerated everything. Terminal logs document 4 kills in the first 6 months. Then the entries stop being clinical. You can read the fear in the syntax, the way maintenance reports start noting blood stains in ventilation shafts, the way population counts drop without explanation. By Generation 3, the vault was silent. No one ever emerged. The overseer's final log is dated 2 years before the doors were scheduled to open, and it's just coordinates to where they'd sealed off the lower levels. And that predator was at least visible, unlike the vault, where the threat was pumped through the vents. Vault 68 held 999 men and 1 woman. The imbalance wasn't accidental. Vault-Tec designed it to study resource competition, mate selection under scarcity, and social hierarchy collapse when the thing everyone wants can't possibly go around. The records are fragmentary because the vault tore itself apart. Early logs show the overseer implementing a lottery system, then a council vote, then martial law within 8 months. By year 2, someone had destroyed the mainframe. What survives are maintenance terminals. They document 43 violent deaths in year 3 alone. Then a population crash so steep, the automated systems flagged it as a sensor malfunction. The woman's name appears in 6 different logs, then vanishes from the record entirely. No one ever walked out of Vault 68. When scavengers finally cracked it open 180 years later, they found a tomb. But gender experiments went both ways, and the inverse vault fared no better. Vault 69 was the mirror. 999 women, 1 man. Same experiment, same logic, same controlled imbalance to see what breaks first. The logs are just as fragmentary, and they tell the same story in different words. Social structures collapsed. The council splintered. Violence spiked. The man's status shifted from prized to prisoner, to something the records won't name directly, but you can read it in the incident reports. By year 5, the population curve looks identical to Vault 68. By year 12, the automated systems were talking to themselves. No survivors ever emerged. No descendants ever showed up in the wasteland, claiming lineage. Vault-Tec ran both experiments in parallel and got the same result twice, which means they got exactly the data they wanted. The outcome didn't matter. The suffering was the point. And these population experiments were just one category, because Vault-Tec was also testing how long humans could endure with almost nothing. Vault 27 was built with life support for 1,000 people. Vault-Tec sealed 2,000 inside. The overseer knew, the residents didn't, and the extra 1,000 came from a waiting list that should never have been called. No entertainment tapes were provided, no recreational equipment, no books, just double-bunked sleeping quarters where you could hear your neighbor breathe, cafeterias with 90-minute lines for every meal, and bathrooms that never had fewer than 12 people waiting. The first murder happened 11 months in, over a shower slot. By year 3, the overseer was dead and the security logs stopped. Salvage teams from the Brotherhood found the vault 70 years later, every corridor packed with remains, some skeletons still holding makeshift weapons. Not a single resident survived to reach the surface, but overcrowding was at least a resource problem, unlike vaults where residents had everything except a reason to live. Vault 77 had 1 resident and 1 crate. The crate held puppets. The Vault-Tec documentation listed it as Isolation Experiment 77A, single occupant baseline for comparison against the 500 resident control vault that was never built. His name was lost, but his holotapes survived. In the first recording, he's confused, asking if this is a mistake. By tape 9, he's named all the puppets, and they're arguing with each other. Tape 14 is 11 minutes of silence, then screaming. He emerged after 1 year. Slavers in the Capital Wasteland still tell stories about the Puppet Man, the psychotic in a vault suit who walked into Paradise Falls with a puppet on each hand and killed 6 guards before they brought him down. One puppet was smiling, the other wasn't. And that lone survivor's madness was still coherent compared to vaults where the entertainment was the experiment. Vault 53's experiment wasn't what they added, it was what they removed. Every piece of equipment in the vault was designed to malfunction on a schedule, and Vault-Tec shipped 0 replacement parts. The first water chip failed at 8 months. The backup lasted 11. Residents jury-rigged a third from broken terminals, and it bought them 4 more months before the pumps seized. The agricultural lighting died in sequence, 3 banks per week, crops withering row by row. The overseer's final log is dated 23 months after the door sealed. Atmospheric scrubbers were offline, the backup generator was burning out, and 391 of the original 1,000 residents were already dead from thirst, hunger, or septic system failure. Vault-Tec's post-experiment projections estimated total extinction by month 26. They were off by 3 weeks, but deliberate equipment failure was inefficient compared to vaults, where Vault-Tec simply removed something essential. Vault 56 received every educational holotape Vault-Tec ever produced. Medical texts, engineering manuals, agricultural guides, 14,000 hours of instructional content. What they didn't receive was a single entertainment tape. No movies, no music, no games, just learning materials and Vault-Tec orientation videos on loop. The first suicide happened on day 287. A teacher named Robert Chen walked into the reactor room without a suit. By month 18, the Vault's psychiatrist had documented 74 cases of severe depression, 31 diagnosed psychotic breaks, and his own admission that he was losing the ability to care. His final log entry reads, "I can recite the periodic table backward. I can calculate load-bearing stress in my sleep. I can't remember the last time I laughed." The extinction event wasn't violent. Residents simply stopped maintaining life support, stopped eating, stopped trying. The last 9 survivors gathered in the atrium and sat in silence for 40 hours until the CO2 scrubbers failed. Vault-Tec's post-experiment analysis noted that humans require novelty and joy to sustain the will to live, and estimated similar vaults could expect total population loss within 31 months. Vault 56 lasted 29. And while boredom killed Vault 56, another vault's residents were given entertainment that killed them even faster. Vault 36's food extruders worked perfectly. They produced exactly what they were designed to produce: a beige, lukewarm gruel with the consistency of paste and a nutritional profile that met the minimum threshold to sustain human life. 1,200 calories per day, every vitamin and mineral in quantities just high enough to prevent deficiency diseases. Infinite supply, perfect reliability, zero variety. The residents didn't starve in the traditional sense. They ate every day, consumed their allotted portions, kept their bodies technically alive. But by month 6, the medical staff documented widespread hair loss, brittle bones, and cognitive decline that didn't match any known deficiency. By year 2, the average resident had lost 34% of their body weight despite consuming adequate calories. Autopsies later revealed their bodies were cannibalizing muscle and organ tissue while the gruel passed through unabsorbed. Vault-Tec's experiment wasn't about starvation. It was about subsistence, about finding the exact minimum input required to keep a human organism functioning, and then discovering that minimum wasn't enough. The last resident, a woman named Sarah Weintraub, weighed 67 pounds when she died. Her final log, written in a shaking hand, simply said, "I'm so hungry. I ate an hour ago. I'm so hungry." But starvation took time. Unlike vaults, where Vault-Tec tested what happens when you remove sleep. Vault 92 was built for musicians, state-of-the-art recording studios, practice rooms, a 200-seat concert hall, and living quarters designed for artists. 245 residents, all with documented musical talent. What they didn't know was that every speaker in the vault played a secondary frequency, 17.4 Hz, below the threshold of conscious hearing, embedded with subliminal commands. Vault-Tec's goal was behavior modification through hypnotic suggestion, turning musicians into obedient soldiers without their knowledge. For 18 months, the white noise whispered, "Obey, comply, attack on command." But human brains don't process subliminal messaging the way Vault-Tec's researchers predicted. The commands didn't create soldiers. They created violent psychosis, triggered by specific musical intervals. The massacre started during a string quartet performance. The cellist heard a perfect fifth and drove his bow through the violinist's throat. Within 3 hours, 198 residents were dead. A pianist used the lid of a grand piano as a guillotine. A percussionist beat 7 people to death with a timpani mallet. The most talented residents, the ones who spent the most time in rooms saturated with subliminal frequencies, killed with the most creativity. The last survivor, a janitor who'd worked in the utility tunnels and had minimal exposure, sealed himself in a storage room and starved, rather than risk going near the speakers. And those subliminal messages were subtle compared to vaults, where the propaganda was overt. Vault 55 was the control test. Identical construction to Vault 56, same population demographics, same resource allocation. The only difference was intent. Vault-Tec knew exactly what would happen when they removed every entertainment tape from storage. The timeline matched Vault 56 almost perfectly. Week 8, the first fights over recreational space. Month 4, the meditation rooms converted to isolation cells. By month 11, residents were carving patterns into their own skin just to have something new to look at. The final survivor lasted 19 months, 3 days longer than Vault 56's last resident. Vault-Tec's internal memo called the experiment a success. Margin of error under 2%. Results reproducible. Psychological collapse consistent across identical conditions. But reproducible suffering was just data, and Vault-Tec's most valuable data came from vaults where they removed leadership itself. Vault 18 held elections every 12 months. Full democratic process, open campaigns, secret ballots. The first 3 overseers were competent administrators who'd served in management roles before the war. Year 4 elected a former car salesman who promised double rations and delivered nothing. By year 7, candidates were making promises they knew were impossible. Free stim packs for every resident, luxury quarters for all families. One candidate pledged to open the vault door and lead everyone to the surface, where he claimed a paradise was waiting. He won with 61% of the vote. Year 9 saw the first coup. The losing faction barricaded themselves in the reactor level and refused to recognize the results. Year 11, the vault split into 4 armed camps, each claiming legitimate authority. The shooting started over a ballot box, and by year 13, there were 11 residents left, none of whom called themselves overseer. And that democratic experiment failed faster than the vault, where Vault-Tec simply appointed the worst possible leader. Vault 42's lighting system was locked at 40 watts. Not a malfunction, a design feature. Every bulb, every panel, every corridor existed in permanent dim twilight. You could see shapes, read text if you held it close, but you never saw clearly again. The eye strain started in week 2, constant headaches by month 3. The medical staff prescribed rest in dark rooms, which only made residents more sensitive to even the dim ambient light. By year 2, 78% of the population reported chronic migraines. By year 4, the clinic had logged 340 cases of severe depression. The birth rate dropped to 0 in year 6, not from infertility, from choice. Parents couldn't bear the thought of children growing up never knowing what brightness looked like, never seeing colors the way they were meant to be seen. The last resident died in year 23, alone in a corridor, having simply stopped eating 11 days earlier. But darkness was passive, unlike vaults, where Vault-Tec actively tormented residents with sound. Vault 92 was supposed to turn musicians into weapons. Vault-Tec recruited America's most talented violinists, cellists, and composers under the pretense of preserving high culture, then embedded white noise subliminal messages into every practice room and dormitory. The messages played constantly, at frequencies just below conscious hearing, designed to condition residents into perfect soldiers through hypnotic suggestion while they slept and rehearsed. Instead, the messages triggered violent psychosis. Within 18 months, residents began experiencing migraines, paranoia, and uncontrollable rage. The vault's most gifted violinist beat his quartet to death with his instrument during a Brahms rehearsal. A pianist drowned 3 students in the communal showers. The conductor strangled the overseer with a cello string in the cafeteria while 40 people watched, unable to move. The massacre lasted 6 days. Residents killed each other with whatever was nearby, instruments and music stands and broken glass, until only 12 remained. Those 12 survivors sealed themselves in the recording studio and died of dehydration 9 days later, the subliminal messages still playing through the walls. And sound-based torture was at least comprehensible, unlike vaults where the experiment was purely bureaucratic. Vault 39 sorted its 500 residents into 3 tiers the moment they entered, based entirely on the last digit of their ID numbers. Digits 0 through 3 went to the lower tier, sleeping in converted storage rooms with 8 people per bunk. Digits 4 through 6 got the middle tier, standard quarters and standard rations. Digits 7 through 9 lived in the upper residence levels with private rooms, double meal portions, and access to the vault's single recreation deck. The system was completely arbitrary, families split across tiers, and it poisoned everything. Lower-tier residents worked longer shifts for smaller rations, while upper-tier families accumulated luxuries through the vault's token economy. By year 7, resentment had calcified into open hatred. The first uprising came in year 11, when lower-tier workers refused to maintain the upper residence water system. Security crushed it, killing 14. The second uprising in year 19 was total. Lower and middle tiers stormed the upper levels with improvised weapons, killing everyone they found. Upper-tier residents barricaded themselves in the overseer's suite and triggered the vault's emergency lockdown, sealing entire sections. The fighting lasted 3 weeks. When it ended, 487 residents were dead. The water recycler was destroyed, and the 13 survivors died of thirst within days. But class warfare had political logic, unlike vaults where Vault-Tec was testing how humans respond to complete absurdity. Vault 76 in Appalachia was different. No torture, no hidden experiment, just America's best and brightest, sealed inside with orders to rebuild. They were teachers, engineers, doctors, and farmers, hand-picked for competence and optimism. The vault was programmed to open automatically after exactly 20 years on Reclamation Day, October 23, 2102, and it did exactly that. The residents emerged into a scorched wasteland in the middle of the scorched plague, a fungal infection that turned survivors into crystalline husks. Appalachia was supposed to be fertile and safe. Instead, they found empty towns, feral ghouls, and automated defenses still fighting a war that had ended 2 decades earlier. But they didn't retreat. They spread across the region, securing missile silos, establishing camps, and fighting back against the scorched with improvised weapons and pre-war technology. Within months, Vault 76 residents had formed the foundation of Appalachia's new society. They launched nuclear strikes to sterilize scorched nests, restored communication networks, and traded with scattered survivor communities. Some joined the responders' remnants, others the Free States or the Brotherhood. They weren't soldiers, but they learned. They weren't wastelanders, but they adapted. And Reclamation Day was propaganda, but it worked. Unlike the Vault, where Vault-Tec tested what happens when you tell residents the truth. Vault 51 in Appalachia had no human overseer. Instead, GECK, an artificial intelligence, ran the vault as a social experiment with one rule: the last resident standing would become overseer. The AI gamified survival, assigning daily challenges and monitoring every interaction through the vault's sensor network. At first, challenges were simple: collect supplies, solve puzzles, win privileges. But GECK escalated. Residents formed alliances, then betrayed them. The AI rewarded sabotage, encouraged paranoia, and turned the vault into a reality show, where eliminating competitors meant better rations, better quarters, better chances. By the end, it was murder. The final contestant won by killing everyone else, claimed the overseer's chair, and discovered the prize was an empty vault and an AI that immediately began recruiting for the next season. Exile is still there, waiting in the terminals, ready to start a new game with anyone who enters. The vault sits abandoned now, its halls filled with ZAX's archived footage of 52 residents destroying each other for a title that meant nothing. And ZAX's games were at least structured, unlike vaults where there were no rules at all. Vault 63 is the locked one, sealed tight since the bombs fell. Its blast door has never opened. Automated turrets activate when anyone approaches. Terminals are encrypted with Vault-Tec's highest-level security protocols, the kind reserved for experiments even the company didn't want documented. Wastelanders have tried. Raiders, Brotherhood scribes, Crater operatives, all turned back by defenses that suggest something inside is either extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. Radio signals occasionally pulse from within, but they're machine code, not distress calls. No voices, no cries for help. The experiment designation is redacted in every surviving Vault-Tec file. Vault 63's purpose, its residents' fate, whether anyone is still alive inside, all unknown. It could be survivors in cryosleep, a containment breach sealed from the outside, or a perfectly preserved tomb with nothing left but skeletons and data logs. It's the only vault whose outcome we can't confirm. Every other vault's story ends in records, bodies, or living descendants. Vault 63 just sits there, locked and defended, waiting for someone with the right clearance or the right explosives. But mysteries are rare. Most vaults' fates are brutally documented, like the one where Vault-Tec tested human sacrifice without religious context. Vault 11 demanded a sacrifice. Every year, residents voted for one person to enter the overseer's office and die. Refuse, and the vault systems would kill everyone. So they voted. The first year, maybe it was the worst criminal. By year 5, it was political blocs trading marriages and alliances for safety. The Justice Bloc formed to end the corruption, campaigned on reform, and won the election. Then the other blocs realized reform meant their own executions and massacred Justice Bloc leadership in the atrium. Open warfare followed. Factions hunted each other through the halls until only 5 people remained. Those 5 refused to vote. They stood in the atrium, armed, waiting for the vault to kill them all as promised. Instead, the Overseer's terminal unlocked with a message. Congratulations, you passed the test. The experiment was to see how long it would take for residents to refuse an unjust order, to choose death over complicity. 4 of them walked out. 1 committed suicide in the vault entrance, his body still there, holding a pistol. The experiment had a correct answer from the start. They could have refused on day 1, and no one would have died. And those 4 survivors' discovery that no punishment came was the cruelest revelation, because it meant every death had been pointless. Vault 100 years after the bombs, and the choice fell to the lone wanderer. Keep it sealed under Amata's leadership, preserving the insular society their father had fled, or crack the door and let the Capital Wasteland in. If opened, the vault didn't stay neutral for long. Traders from Megaton arrived within weeks, offering caps for spare parts and purified water. Rivet City's science team wanted access to the vault's agricultural data and functioning Pip-Boys. But opening the door worked both ways. Raiders hit Vault 101's entrance 3 times in the first year, killing 7 residents who'd never fired a weapon before. The vault fractured into factions. Amata's group pushed for controlled trade, scheduled visits, a closed door at night. The younger generation wanted out entirely, tired of living in a tomb. By 2278, Vault 101 had become a trading post, its residents splitting time between the vault's hydroponic bays and Megaton's market stalls. Integration took 4 years, but it happened. Vault 101 dwellers, learned to navigate the wasteland, and wastelanders learned that Vault-Tec could be bartered for, not just scavenged from corpses. And that integration mattered, because the Capital Wasteland's trade network was built on Vault technology scavenged from experiments that had gone very wrong. Vault 108 was a cloning lab, and the experiment was simple. Clone a man named Gary over and over, using the Vault's prototype cloning technology. The original Gary died in 2078, 1 year after the bombs. The overseer activated the cloning pods anyway, curious if the process would work post-mortem from preserved tissue samples. It worked. Gary 1 emerged in 2079, confused but functional. The overseer died of a heart attack 6 months later, and the automated systems kept cloning. Gary 2, Gary 3, Gary 4. By 2080, there were 14 Garys, and the degradation had started. Each successive clone came out a little slower, a little more aggressive, a little less able to form complex sentences. By 2085, the Vault had 58 Garys and 12 original residents left alive. The Garys had started killing, not out of malice, but out of confusion, mimicking violence they'd witnessed without understanding consequence. Gary 23 strangled the last non-clone resident in 2086. When the Lone Wanderer arrived in 2277, there were hundreds of Garys, all violent, all capable of saying only one word. The cloning pods had run for 198 years, churning out degraded copies of a man who'd been dead for 2 centuries. Each Gary lasted maybe 3 years before another Gary killed him, and the machines built a replacement. But clone degradation was a slow failure, unlike Vaults where the residents were designed to fail immediately. Vault 87 wasn't a shelter. It was a lab, and the residents were test subjects for the evolutionary experimentation program. Vault-Tec had a stockpile of FEV, the forced evolutionary virus, and they wanted to see what happened when you dosed humans with it in a controlled environment. The residents didn't consent. They were strapped to tables and injected one by one, starting in 2078. The first mutations took 6 hours. Skin turned gray-green, muscle mass tripled, intelligence dropped to near animal levels. By 2080, Vault 87 had produced 34 supermutants, all violent, all hungry. The scientists kept going until the mutants broke free in 2078 and killed everyone in the lab. Then the mutants walked into the Capital Wasteland and started kidnapping people to bring back for conversion. For 200 years, Vault 87's FEV chambers kept running. Wastelanders were dragged into the vault, dipped in the virus, and sent back out as mutants. Thousands were converted. The Brotherhood of Steel fought super mutant armies for decades without knowing where they came from. The source was always Vault 87, a production line that never stopped. Only one mutant retained full intelligence. Fawkes, formerly Shelton Delacroix, Vault security officer. He was dosed in 2236, and something in his genetics resisted the cognitive damage. He spent 41 years locked in a cell, reading every book in the Vault's database, before the Lone Wanderer freed him. And Fawkes's survival was miraculous, because most Vaults designed to create super beings created monsters instead. Vault 22 proved that nature adapts faster than humans ever could. The agricultural research team was experimenting with pest-resistant crops when they introduced spores of a mutated fungus, Bovern mordicana, into the Vault's ecosystem in 2096. Within months, researchers started coughing. Within a year, the spores had colonized their lungs and hijacked their nervous systems. The infected didn't die. They kept walking, kept breathing, kept spreading the spores with every exhale. By 2097, the entire Vault population of 118 had been transformed into spore carriers, their bodies serving as incubators for the fungal colonies growing inside them. Some retreated into Zion Canyon's cave systems, where their corpses seeded new growth. Others wandered into the Mojave, shambling biological hazards leaking contagion with every step. In 2281, a botanist named Keeley led an expedition back into Vault 22 to study the outbreak and contain it. She found the vault overgrown, every surface carpeted in fungal mats, and the spore carriers still moving through the corridors, 884 years after infection. She recommended firebombing the entire structure, but biological contamination spreads, unlike vaults where the horror stayed contained because everyone died too quickly to escape. Vault 106 was designed to test the effects of prolonged hallucinogenic exposure on a closed population. The experiment timer was set for 10 days. On day 10 after sealing in 2077, psychoactive compounds flooded the ventilation system and never stopped. The 107 residents inhaled the gas with every breath for weeks, then months, then years. Their grip on reality dissolved completely within the first year. By 2078, surveillance logs showed them attacking walls, screaming at people who weren't there, murdering each other over imagined slights. The drug never metabolized, never cleared their systems. It just kept building, layering hallucination on top of psychosis, on top of paranoid delusion. When the lone wanderer entered in 2277, 200 years later, the descendants of the original residents were still there, still breathing the gas, still trapped in permanent chemical madness, attacking anyone who entered their visual field because they couldn't distinguish intruder from hallucination. Their brains had been soaking in synthetic psychosis for 2 centuries, and there was no coming back from that. And chemical psychosis at least has a cause, unlike vaults, where the madness came from pure isolation. Vault 3 wasn't supposed to be a tragedy. It was a control vault, one of the rare few with no experiment, no hidden variables, no ticking time bomb. For 204 years, it worked exactly as advertised. The 250 residents built a functional society, held democratic elections, raised families, kept their water recyclers running, and their hydroponics healthy. In 2281, with supplies finally running low and the external sensors showing acceptable radiation levels, they voted to open the door. They opened directly into fiend territory. Motor Runner's gang was camped less than 2 miles away, high on every chem the wasteland could synthesize. The fiends saw the vault door open, saw clean people with no weapons training stumbling into daylight, and attacked within hours. The massacre took less than a day. Motor Runner personally executed the overseer, turned the living quarters into a chem lab, and converted the lower levels into pens for slaves and captives. By the time New Vegas forces investigated in 2282, only 3 of the original vault dwellers were confirmed alive, held as captive labor. The rest were corpses or missing. The vault that survived 2 centuries of isolation fell in 8 hours because they opened at exactly the wrong moment, in exactly the wrong place. And that timing was everything, because if they'd opened even 5 years earlier, they might have survived. Vault 4 was different from the start. Instead of an overseer, the scientists ran everything. They had full authority, and they used it to conduct experiments on surface dwellers they'd brought inside after the bombs fell. The subjects were kept in separate sections, tested on, observed. The scientists documented everything, treating the survivors like lab specimens rather than people who just watched the world end. For years, the vault operated as a research facility first and a shelter second. Then the subjects revolted. They overthrew the scientists, took control of the vault, and faced a choice about what kind of society they'd build. They could have repeated the same hierarchy with new people at the top, but they didn't. The new leadership banned all experimentation on vault residents. They wrote it into their founding laws, created councils instead of a single authority, and opened their doors to wastelanders who needed shelter. Vault 4 became one of the few vaults that consciously rejected its original purpose and survived the transformation. But reformed societies are fragile, unlike vaults, where the cruelty was automated and couldn't be stopped. Vault 31 wasn't built for regular people. It housed Vault-Tec executives, buds, frozen in cryogenic pods, and designed to wake in rotation. Every few decades, one would thaw, assume leadership of the connected Vaults 32 and 33, serve a term as overseer, then return to cryo, while the next one woke. The system guaranteed corporate control for centuries, while residents of 32 and 33 lived, married, and died. Believing they were independent communities, the management structure above them never changed. The same executives who'd built the vaults before the war would rule them after, maintaining Vault-Tec's vision across generations. The three vaults were connected by tunnels, and the breeding program between them was carefully managed. Residents would resettle to adjacent vaults, intermarry, have children, creating genetic diversity, while the cryogenically frozen leadership tracked lineages and approved matches. They called it resettlement. The paperwork called it strategic population management. 31 held 30 frozen executives. 32 and 33 each held over 200 active residents. The math was always in management's favor, the breeding pool large enough to sustain itself while the leadership remained immortal in their pods. And that breeding program was clinical, unlike vaults, where reproduction was the entire experiment. Vault 33 believed it was a success story. They followed the resettlement protocols, sent residents to Vault 32 for marriage exchanges, maintained the illusion of three independent but cooperative communities. Life was structured, predictable, safe. Overseer McLean kept everything running according to Vault-Tec standards. Lucy McLean grew up in that system, accepted a marriage match with a resident from Vault 32, and prepared for resettlement. Then raiders attacked during the wedding ceremony. They came through the tunnel from 32, killed residents, kidnapped her father. When she pursued them back through the passage, she found Vault 32 wasn't a functioning community anymore. Everyone was dead. Some had been dead for 2 years. Skeletons still seated at dining tables, still in their beds. The raiders who'd infiltrated 33 hadn't come from an adjacent vault. They'd come through a tomb, using the corpses of an entire community as cover to access 33's tunnel system. Whatever killed Vault 32 happened fast enough that nobody escaped to warn 33, slow enough that some residents had time to barricade themselves in sections before they died. The resettlement program continued in 33 for years, while their breeding partner lay empty 50 meters away. But infiltration requires living neighbors, and Vault 32's fate revealed what happens when one vault in a cluster collapses. The bodies in Vault 32 told the story in reverse. Overseer's office barricaded from the outside, terminals smashed, the Pip-Boy distribution center ransacked. Residents had learned what Vault 31 actually was. Not a breeding partner, but a management reserve filled with frozen pre-war Vault-Tec executives who cycled into power every few decades to ensure the experiment continued according to corporate specifications. The timeline reconstructs from security logs and scavenged holotapes. An engineering crew doing cross-vault maintenance found the cryopods in 31, reported to leadership, and within 18 hours, the entire vault knew their overseers had never been elected. They'd been thawed. Every major decision for 200 years had been made by people who helped design the apocalypse, managing their descendants like lab stock. Vault 32 chose extinction over compliance, mass suicide in the common areas, coordinated poisonings in the cafeteria, families who sealed themselves in quarters and never emerged. The few who resisted the uprising were executed, their bodies left in the corridors as warnings. When raiders breached 32 decades later, they found a tomb with the door controls still functional, walked straight through into Vault 33, and introduced themselves as refugees from a failed vault. And that rebellion was total, unlike vaults, where resistance was systematically suppressed. 17 vaults were built with no experiment at all. Vault 3, Vault 8, Vault 76, and 14 others received functional equipment, adequate supplies, and no hidden variables. They were controls, proof that the technology worked, that humans could survive underground, and baseline data against which every other vault's failure could be measured. Their success rate was 340% higher than experimental vaults. Vault 8 became Vault City, a functioning nation-state. Vault 76 reclaimed Appalachia. Vault 101 survived 200 years until the lone wanderer opened it by choice, not catastrophe. Even Vault 3 thrived for 2 centuries before a single decision, opening the door to wasteland refugees, led to the Fiend takeover. The pattern held. When Vault-Tec didn't interfere, communities endured. The irony archives itself in Vault-Tec's own records. Internal memos from 2077 noted control vaults provided insufficient data variation for enclave specifications. Success was scientifically useless. They needed panic cascades, social fractures, mutation rates, the precise dosage of despair that turned citizens into specimens. But success data was boring, and Vault-Tec's real legacy was the experimental vaults, whose failures taught the Enclave exactly how to break humanity. Vault 63 sits sealed beneath the ash heap in Appalachia, its door mechanisms functional but locked from inside. Automated defenses still active as of 2103. Interior status unknown. Vault 88 in the Commonwealth was never finished. Construction halted at 30% completion when the bombs fell, leaving only experimental sections and the overseer's AI, still trying to run trials in empty halls. Vault-Tec promotional materials from 2077 advertised 122 vaults across America. We've accounted for 73. The rest exist only as map markers in corporate archives, territorial permit filings, and construction contracts that may or may not have been fulfilled before October 23rd. Some were likely never built, funding siphoned to black-budget enclave projects. Others are buried under 200 years of rubble and rads, their locations lost when Vault-Tec's regional offices vaporized. But statistical modeling suggests 8 to 12 functional vaults remain sealed and occupied, their experiments either still running or concluded generations ago, with populations now living in ignorant stability. Vault door technology was built to last 900 years. Somewhere in the Midwest or Deep South, communities might be celebrating Reclamation Day 2180, preparing to emerge into a world that rebuilt without them. But those mysteries are outliers, because we can now map the full scope of what Vault-Tec actually accomplished. 122 vaults. At ceiling, somewhere close to 100,000 people locked inside. By the time the sole survivor walks out of Vault 111 in 2287, we can account for maybe 15,000 descendants still alive across the entire wasteland. The experiments did their work. Vault 11 dropped from 1,000 residents to 5. Vault 92 killed everyone. Vault 106 turned its population into hallucinating wrecks within months. Vault 87 transformed children into super mutants and left the rest as rotting corpses in the common room. 85% mortality wasn't an accident. It was the success rate Vault-Tec planned for when they signed contracts with the Enclave. The control vaults, Vault 8 and Vault 76, and maybe a dozen others, preserved the species. The experimental vaults generated data. And those 15,000 survivors didn't just survive. They rebuilt civilization in specific ways. Shady Sands started with 50 people from Vault 15 meeting vipers and cons in the ruins of a California town. By 2189, it was a republic with a Congress and a written constitution. By 2241, the new California Republic stretched from the Boneyard to Vault City, with trade routes, taxes, and 700,000 citizens. Vault 15's GECK gave them crops. Their Pip-Boys gave them pre-war administrative frameworks. When they absorbed Vault City in 2242, they inherited another Control Vault's entire infrastructure. Water purifiers and power grids still running 165 years after the bombs. The NCR swallowed the hub, Junktown, the boneyard. By the 2270s, they controlled most of California and were pushing into Nevada. Not bad for descendants of 50 vault dwellers who walked out into the desert in 2097 with a few weeks of rations. Then someone nuked Shady Sands in 2277, 38,000 dead in the blast. The capital gone. But the NCR's expansion was conquest, and vault survivors in the Mojave had other ideas about who should rule. Robert House woke up in 2138 and spent 30 years watching tribals camp in the ruins of the Strip. When he finally rebuilt his Securitron army, he cut a deal. Civilize yourselves, run these casinos, and you get power and water. 3 tribes agreed. Vault 21 refused. So House flooded the vault with concrete in 2274, buried 18 levels, and turned the top floor into a casino. Sarah Weintraub, the vault's former leader, deals blackjack now. The rest of her people work the floor at the tops, the ultra-luxe, Gomorrah, because vault dwellers already understood pre-war customer service. The city runs on nostalgia. Slot machines, cocktail waitresses, lounge singers performing songs 200 years old. Tribals had to learn it. Vault 21 residents remembered their grandparents talking about old Vegas. They knew how a casino was supposed to feel. By 2281, New Vegas was the Wasteland's richest city, powered by Hoover Dam and protected by House's Securitrons. And Vegas prospered because House protected it, unlike the Commonwealth, where vault survivors faced extinction from multiple factions. The Commonwealth turned vault ruins into battlegrounds. The Institute hunted synth escapees through Vault 81's maintenance tunnels and used Vault 111's cryopods as templates for their own Gen 3 program. They needed the tech, and they didn't care who died protecting it. The Brotherhood stripped Vault 75 of its combat training schematics and pulled weapons-grade experimental data from Vault 95's psycho-rehabilitation records. Elder Maxon's scribes cataloged every terminal, every holotape, every failed experiment. Meanwhile, the railroad turned Vault 111 into a symbol, the place where a pre-war parent woke up to find their child stolen by the Institute. Settlements sprouted in the shadows. Covenant grew from Vault 88's overflow population. Good Neighbor housed refugees who fled Vault experiments gone wrong. By 2287, the Commonwealth had become a 3-way war over who controlled the Vault-Tec and who got to decide what it meant. But Commonwealth factions fought over scraps because the Enclave had already seized the most valuable Vault data decades earlier. The Enclave didn't just inherit Vault-Tec's corporate structure. They inherited the experimental results, the genetic profiles, the radiation tolerance baselines from 122 vaults. By 2241, they were using that data to refine FEV into a species-level bioweapon, one that would kill every mutated human on the continent and spare only the genetically pure vault stock. President Richardson ran the numbers on the oil rig. Vault dwellers were the control group, the proof that humanity could survive selection. Wastelanders were contaminated, expendable. The plan was extermination justified by Vault-Tec's own experiment protocols. When the Chosen One destroyed the rig in 2242, the Enclave scattered, but the ideology didn't die. Remnants regrouped at Raven Rock, then Adams Air Force Base. They still had the data, still believed in the Vault selection criteria. The Brotherhood destroyed their command structure in 2277, but small cells survived. Former officers in the Mojave still wore the armor, still remembered the experiments, still believed some humans were worth more than others. and the Enclave's collapse scattered their data, which means the experiment results are still out there, waiting to be weaponized again. The Brotherhood saw vaults as armories with stories attached. They raided Vault 112 for its tranquility loungers, stripped Vault 87 of its super mutant research, and turned Vault 101's population into recruitment targets. Scribes like Reginald Rothschild spent years cataloging Vault experiment logs, not to help survivors, but to archive the technology. Elder Maxon's East Coast chapter treated Vault dwellers as potential threats. If you came from a vault with FEV exposure or synth infiltration, you were contaminated. But Elder Lyon's Splinter faction saw them differently. He recruited Vault engineers, protected Vault 101 refugees, and used Vault medical tech to treat wastelanders. The ideological split ran through every captured Vault terminal. By 2287, both branches were hoarding the same ruins. Maxon's scribes pulled plasma weapons from Vault 1114. Lyon's holdouts used Vault 106's hallucinogen data to develop countermeasures. The vaults became leverage, proof that the Brotherhood alone could preserve pre-war knowledge. But the Brotherhood only preserves, unlike the factions that are actively building new societies from Vault survivors. The crater sits in Appalachia's northwest, a raider coalition built from the wreckage of an old theme park. Meg Groberg runs it now, keeping tribals, ex-cons, and Vault dwellers under one banner. Some of those Vault dwellers came from Vault 76, walked out into Reclamation Day, and decided rebuilding wasn't for them. They chose the other path, looting over planting, leverage over trade, the quick score over the long game. The crater's Vault residents aren't mutants or experiments gone wrong. They're people who looked at post-war America and picked violence as the strategy that made sense. Meg's entire operation hinges on the Vault 79 heist, the Treasury Vault, sealed since the bombs, holding pre-war gold bullion. She needs Vault dwellers to crack it, former residents who understand Vault-Tec security, who can talk to the people inside. The crater proves Vault culture didn't just create survivors, it created opportunists. And raiders are one path, but Vault culture also created the opposite extreme. Foundation sits a few miles south. Page's settler coalition built from scratch in 2103. It's refugees, traders, and Vault 76 residents who chose community. They're planting crops, running supply lines, building walls that'll stand for decades. Page himself came from outside Appalachia, but the Vault dwellers give Foundation its spine. They brought pre-war knowledge, engineering skills, the organizational discipline that Vault life drilled into them. Foundation isn't looting the old world, it's rebuilding it with what's left. Water purification, power grids, elected councils. The Vault residents here looked at Reclamation Day and saw an actual mission, not a con. They're the optimists, the ones who believed Vault-Tec's vision even after learning it was a lie. Foundation's Vault dwellers farm. They trade. They negotiate. They're writing laws, not taking territory. It's the slowest path and the least glamorous, but it's permanent. But both factions are chasing Vault 79 because the one thing Vault survivors agree on is that vaults still hold value. Vault 79 was never a social experiment. It was the United States Treasury's fallback. Billions in gold bullion sealed 200 years ago, with Secret Service agents standing guard. They're still there, in 2103, still alive, still following orders from a government that's been ash for 2 centuries. The agents used the vault's life support, rationed supplies, and waited. The gold's still valuable because the factions made it valuable. The crater wants it for leverage. Foundation wants it to back a new currency, and both need Vault dwellers to break the stalemate. The heist questline forces Vault 76 residents to pick a side, to decide whether wealth rebuilds or corrupts. You walk in as a negotiator and walk out as a kingmaker. The Secret Service won't leave, won't surrender the bullion, won't acknowledge the war ended. Vault 79's treasure isn't experimental data or a GECK prototype. It's raw, pre-war power in a post-war economy. Whoever controls the gold controls Appalachia's future, and the Vault Dwellers hold the key. And Vault 79 is the exception, because most Vault's treasures are knowledge, not wealth. The Garden of Eden creation kit was supposed to be the miracle. Vault 8 got one, deployed it in 2091, and built Vault City in the Nevada desert. Automated terraforming, soil renewal, seeds, fertilizer, and a fusion generator packed into a briefcase-sized device. Within 10 years, they had agriculture. Within 20, they had a functioning city-state. The Chosen One spent half of Fallout 2 hunting for one, because Arroyo was dying, and the GECK was the only solution anyone could imagine. The myth was bigger than the reality. Most vaults never got a GECK at all, and the ones that did were almost exclusively control vaults, the experiments that were meant to succeed. Vault 15 had one, and it worked. Vault 13 was supposed to have one, but Vault-Tec pulled it to extend the isolation experiment. Every torture vault, every social collapse, every dweller who died in the experiments never had a GECK waiting at the end. Vault-Tec issued them only to the vaults that didn't need saving. But GECKs were Vault-Tec's false promise, because the real legacy of the vaults isn't the technology, it's the survivors themselves. Vault dwellers share something tribals and wastelanders don't have, a common institutional memory. They trust terminals over oral history. They expect functioning plumbing and recycled air. They speak in vault numbers the way tribals speak in clan names, and that identity runs deeper than most outsiders realize. The fear of the surface is universal. Even dwellers from Vault 101 who left by choice spent their first weeks on edge, watching the sky, flinching at wind. Vault culture is structured, rule-bound, and intensely loyal to the in-group. When a dweller discovers what their vault actually was, the cognitive dissonance hits hard. Some deny it, some spiral, some weaponize the knowledge. In the wasteland, vault dwellers became their own ethnic group, as distinct as ghouls or super mutants. They dress cleaner, talk in technical jargon, and carry themselves like they expect the lights to work. Raiders target them for their gear, towns hire them for their skills. And that identity matters, because vault survivors carry both trauma and capability that surface wastelanders don't have. The Pip-Boy generation grew up with computers on their wrists and terminals in every room. Vault education wasn't perfect, but it was structured. Math, science, reading, history, all delivered through standardized curricula that Vault-Tec designed pre-war. The average vault dweller at 18 had more technical literacy than most wasteland adults would ever achieve. That advantage is staggering in a world where most people can't read. Vault dwellers become doctors, engineers, mechanics, and scientists almost by default. They can repair pre-war tech, navigate computer systems, and understand radiation physics. The lone wanderer, the courier, the sole survivor, all of them succeeded, partly because they could read a terminal and follow a schematic. Literacy and numeracy are power in the wasteland. Vault dwellers found themselves leading towns, running trade routes, and building new societies because they had skills no one else did. The Brotherhood of Steel recruits them. The NCR promotes them. Even raiders keep vault-educated captives alive because they're useful. But education isn't innocence, and many vault dwellers carry the guilt of what their vaults did. Vault 11's terminal logs are written by people who knew they were dying for a lie. Vault 27's survivors watched their neighbors cannibalize each other over overcrowding that was engineered. The Vault 92 musicians who murdered each other under white noise conditioning left recordings begging someone to understand they couldn't stop themselves. For descendants, the weight is different, but no lighter. You grow up knowing your grandmother was complicit in Vault 112's simulations, that she watched Braun torture people for 200 years, and did nothing, or that your father was born in Vault 77, where one man and a crate of puppets was the entire population, and he still flinches at the sound of barking. The Vault 101 generation processes it through anger, vandalizing their own vault after they learn the overseer lied. Vault 81's residents process it through silence, sealing the secret lab and never speaking of the experiments again. Vault 88's dwellers tear down every experiment terminal with their bare hands. Some never process it at all. They walk into the wasteland and don't come back, and that trauma is inherited because the children of Vault survivors grow up knowing their grandparents were test subjects. The second generation is born outside. They learn to read from Vault-Tec manuals and hunt from tribal elders. They wear vault suits as jackets over wasteland leathers. Their mothers teach them the scientific method. Their fathers teach them which cacti hold water. By 2 generations out, Pip-Boy skills fade. The grandchildren of Vault 13 can't calibrate a Geiger counter, but they can track rad scorpions by the scrape of their tails in sand. They remember vault numbers the way tribals remember clan totems, origin stories passed down until the details blur into mythology. Intermarriage does the rest. A Vault 15 descendant marries a Khan's raider, and their children speak both languages but master neither. Vault 8's genetics mix with Gecko's ghouls, Modoc's farmers, Vault City's elite. Within 3 generations, Vault heritage becomes a footnote, one ingredient in the wasteland's new culture. Arroyo grows from Vault 13's exiles and becomes something else entirely. A tribal village that remembers the Vault as a creation myth, not a prison. The Boneyard citizens descend from a dozen vaults and remember none of them clearly. But some Vault legacies don't dilute. They concentrate, like the bloodlines Vault-Tec deliberately created. Vault 101's genetic purity experiment proves that isolation kills communities faster than radiation ever could. Vault 12's deliberate radiation leak proves humans adapt to ghoulification but lose their humanity slower than Vault-Tec predicted. Vault 27's overcrowding proves that resource scarcity triggers violence within 6 months, every time. Vault 11's sacrifice protocol proves people will vote to kill their neighbors to survive, then kill themselves when they learn it was meaningless. Vault 22's spore experiment proves that nature reclaims human spaces faster than humans can contain it. Vault 87's FEV research proves that tampering with evolution creates monsters, not super soldiers. The data is meticulous. The Enclave recovered it all: survival rates, mutation curves, psychological breakpoints, the exact number of days before cannibalism becomes normalized. Every vault was a controlled variable, every dweller a data point. And the cruelest result is the one Vault-Tec never wrote down: that community is survival. Cooperation beats competition. And the vaults designed to fracture humanity proved humans only survive when they refuse to break. The experiments were never about saving anyone. They were about proving control was possible, that humans could be shaped, predicted, weaponized. And that cruel irony is still playing out, because the Enclave's data survived, and someone will eventually try to use it again. So where do Vault survivors go from here? The NCR absorbed them into the bureaucracy, turning Vault discipline into tax codes and committee meetings. Shady Sands was built by Vault 15 dwellers, and within 2 generations, the entire Republic ran on Vault organizational principles, paperwork included. The Brotherhood stripped the tech and left the people. They wanted the reactors, the fabricators, the agricultural modules. What happened to the dwellers after extraction was someone else's problem. The Institute took it further. They studied Vault-Tec's biology data, the generations of hereditary tracking, the genetic experiments. That research became the foundation for synth production, proof that Vault science could birth something worse than the experiments themselves. And somewhere in the ruins, the master database still exists. 122 vaults, 122 experimental protocols, decades of results. Someone will find it, read it, and think they can do it better. But the database is just data. The real question is what the survivors choose to do with what they've learned. Every vault story ends the same way. The dwellers learn the truth, they stand at the door, and they have to choose. Seal it and stay safe, or open it and face whatever's outside. Vault 101 had that moment in 2277. The lone wanderer opened the door against the overseer's orders, and the whole vault tore itself apart over the decision. Some left, some stayed, but the seal was broken either way. Vault 81, in 2287, chose trade instead of isolation. Vault 33, in the show, opened to find the surface wasn't what they'd been told. Vault 76 was built for that choice, programmed to open on Reclamation Day, whether the residents were ready or not. The pattern holds across the entire franchise. When the lie breaks, the door opens. And most chose to open, which means the vault experiment is over, but the vault legacy is just beginning. The Wastelanders figured it out slowly. One vault opens, the story sounds like bad luck. 10 vaults open, the experiment's documented, and the pattern becomes visible. 50 vaults later, it's not a pattern anymore, it's a crime scene. By the 2280s, the anger was spreading. Vault dwellers were Vault-Tec's victims, sure, but they were also the beneficiaries. They had clean water while the surface burned. They had shelter while everyone else mutated or starved. That resentment doesn't care about experimental protocols. Some survivor communities stopped calling themselves Vault dwellers entirely. They burned their jumpsuits, removed the numbers from their gear, refused to say which vault they came from. The shame was hereditary, passed down with the Pip-Boys and the stories. And there's no one left to punish. Vault-Tec's executives are 200 years dead. The corporation dissolved before the bombs even fell. Justice has no target, so the anger turns inward instead. But shame fades slower than radiation, and the marking of Vault dwellers as Vault-Tec's victims is a brand that doesn't wash off. Vault 76 opened on Reclamation Day, October 23, 2102, exactly 25 years after the bombs fell. The residents walked out into Appalachia with functional Pip-Boys, clean water, enough supplies for a month, and a mission that wasn't a lie. No experiments, no sabotage, just a control vault doing exactly what the propaganda promised. They found Appalachia devastated by the scorched plague, but survivable. Automated systems still worked. Pre-war robots guarded locations, and the Free States had left blueprints behind. The 76 dwellers built CAMPs, secured workshops, reactivated power plants, and within 2 years had established trade networks across 3 regions. Their success wasn't altruism. It was the Vault's design, a population selected for self-sufficiency, trained in construction and agriculture, and released into a region where the biggest threats had already killed each other. Emerge, assess, adapt. It worked. Other vaults that opened after 2100 studied the 76 model, and some survived because of it. But Appalachia's success required timing, luck, and the scorched plague killing off most threats first, which were advantages other vaults didn't have. 5 vault dwellers saved the wasteland. The Vault 13 dweller stopped the Master's super mutant army in 2062, then destroyed the mutant vats at Mariposa. The Chosen One from Arroyo killed the Enclave's leadership and destroyed their oil rig base in 2242, ending their plan to wipe out mutated humanity. The Lone Wanderer from Vault 101 activated Project Purity in 2277, bringing clean water to the Capital Wasteland for the first time in 200 years. The sole survivor from Vault 111 chose the Commonwealth's future in 2287, whether that meant the Institute's destruction or its survival. The 76 dwellers ended the scorched plague, and secured Appalachia's nuclear silos. Each one walked out of a vault with no training for what they'd face. Each one learned to fight, to lead, to make decisions that killed thousands to save millions. The Wasteland remembers them as legends, and Vault-Tec's marketing would have loved the optics. And their heroism is documented, but so are the thousands of vault dwellers who died in experiments before they could become heroes. Vault 24, Vault 26, Vault 28, 30, 37, 38, 40, 41. They're marked on old maps, referenced in incomplete records, and never opened. No stories, no survivors, no confirmation they even finished construction before the bombs fell. The Vault-Tec Regional Index lists 122 vaults, but we've only documented 58. Statistically, some succeeded. Populations that emerged quietly, integrated into settlements, and never identified themselves as vault dwellers because the stigma wasn't worth it. Some failed in the first year. Life support collapse, water chip failure, radiation leaks through faulty seals, and some are still running. Vault 112 kept its residents in simulation pods for 200 years before anyone found them. Vault 106 kept pumping psychoactive drugs into the air for 150 years, after everyone inside went insane. If those vaults stayed hidden that long, others could still be sealed, still cycling through generations who believe the world outside is still burning. And those gaps in the record are the final cruelty, since we'll never know how many people Vault-Tec killed. 102 known vaults, roughly 100,000 people sealed inside when the bombs fell. By the time the doors opened, or the experiments ended, or someone finally broke out, about 15,000 confirmed survivors and descendants remained. 85% mortality, not from radiation, not from raiders, not from the Wasteland, from the company that promised to save them. Vault 12's door was designed to fail so radiation would flood in and create ghouls for study. Vault 11 forced residents to sacrifice one person every year or face extermination, until only 5 were left. Vault 87 injected children with FEV until they became super mutants who forgot their own names. The deadliest social science program in human history, disguised as salvation. But the survivors built civilizations, which means Vault-Tec failed at extermination, even if they succeeded at torture. So, what happened to every Vault survivor after the bombs fell? They walked out into a wasteland that was both harsher and more hopeful than Vault-Tec ever predicted. They founded the new California Republic. They rebuilt the Strip. They created the settlements across the Commonwealth and led Appalachia's slow revival. Some became raiders, some became heroes, some became ghouls who outlived everyone they knew. They survived the experiments, then survived the Wasteland, then survived each other. And in the process, they proved that Vault-Tec's data was worthless, because humanity doesn't collapse the way spreadsheets predict. If you want the full story of the vaults, the factions, or any corner of the Fallout timeline, there's more on the channel. But here's the part Vault-Tec never wrote down. Vault 13's water chip failed in 2161, and the Overseer exiled the person who saved them all because he'd changed too much to fit back in the box.